Manufacturing Hub. Very happy to be back after a short, brief hiatus from last week. I hope you guys didn't miss us too much. This month, for the next 4 weeks of July and the first week of August, we're digging into standardizations in automation, which is an exciting topic. I don't even know how we're going to come close to covering it all, but very excited to go do that. We do want to thank our sponsor, Siemens, for going ahead and continuing to support the show. If you guys are new here, welcome. If you've been here before, welcome back. If you are new here, we do our very best to kind of have open conversations. We have generally a very active chat. So if you guys are in the chat, please feel free to go ahead and say hi, tell us where you're from. Please feel free to go ahead and ask questions. We do our very best to go ahead and get all of the questions answered as we get through this. And if we don't get all of your questions answered, we do our very best to go back after the chat, after the show, to go ahead and answer those questions. So without further ado, everyone, officially welcome to Manufacturing Hub. I am Dave. This guy up here is Vlad. All month long, we're talking about standardization in automation, powered by Siemens. And today we'd like to welcome Garett Williams to the show. Garett, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Vlad. Very excited to be here today, talking with you guys and the audience.
Awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time, Garett. Before we dive into the conversation about standardization, could you give us a little bit of a background about yourself? How did you get started in manufacturing automation? What was your career path like, and ultimately where you are today?
Sure. Well, I've been in the industry for about 24 years, so going way back. It started with, I've always had a passion for technology and automation. So I majored in electrical engineering in school, got a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering. And, it was that time in college, I also realized that my passion wasn't just technology and automation, but also people, and working with people, solving problems for people. I did peer counseling and things like that in college. So that really put me on a sales and business development track, which led to a job with Siemens. I started with Siemens right out of school. Went into what they called at the time was the Siemens Sales Engineer Training Program. We have similar programs today. They have different names, but they're very similar. I strongly encourage anyone that can go through a program like that, whether it be through Siemens or anyone else, to really take advantage of it. Because what that program did for me is it gave me a strong foundation in a variety of industries, a variety of functions, sales, engineering, marketing, etc. And it was just a fantastic experience. After that experience, which was, like I said, it was about a 2-year program. For me, it was a little bit truncated because they needed someone to go into sales in the St. Louis area, which is where I'm from, right away. And so I went into sales, spent about close to 15 years in sales with Siemens, all different types of capacities, from an individual contributor up through management. Again, very fortunate to have a lot of different types of customers, a lot of different industries, very dynamic job. Beyond that, my passion was always automation. So the opportunity came up to go to the business unit, specifically the factory automation business unit for Siemens. So when I say factory automation for us, that's PLC, IO, HMI, SCADA, and PC-based automation. So that's essentially what we mean when we say factory automation. So I went into a business development management role with factory automation, and did that, had the Western US for quite a few years, had even the entire US for a period of time. Really got a lot of new perspectives, because when you look at the US and you look at automation, you look at our industry, there's a lot of variance, region to region, both geographically, as well as vertically based on the industry. So learned a lot there, which led me to the point where an opportunity came up for me to go work for a systems integrator. So again, I've been with Siemens my entire career, so it was a big deal for me to even consider leaving Siemens. But the opportunity, we wanted to be a director of business development at a national systems integrator. And what that meant for me at the time was really an opportunity I always looked at things through a Siemens lens, always looked at things through a product lens. But what did things, I feel like if I'm really going to be fair to myself and even to my customers, what do things look like outside of Siemens? So I learned a whole lot more about who I always perceived as competitors in the past, but they were my partners as a systems integrator. And also more about services. When you're selling a product is one component of the solution. Services is the other side. So really learning how to work successfully with our system integration partners or our manufacturing partners as we integrated projects for customers. So I did that for about 3 years. Again, got a lot out of the experience, but there's no question, I've got Siemens in my blood. So had an opportunity to come back to Siemens, and so here I am. Today, my current role, I've been back for about 7 months. My current role is Portfolio Development Specialist for Industrial I/O. So that's a lot of words, right? But basically what that means is it's a bit of a unique role for us in factory automation, even for Siemens, in that part of my role is to be out supporting our sales team and our partners, integrators and distributors alike, in supporting our industrial I/O sales. Also, a big part of my role, big focus is finding new paths to grow our business. How do we grow our business? In the past, Siemens has always been very kind of bundled approach to how we promote I/O as part of a Siemens solution. But especially as we look at standardization, it opens up the doors to selling I/O even when there's not a PLC, a Siemens PLC. We can talk about that more. So that's part of my role. And another big part of my role is Siemens is a global leader. Everyone's aware of that, right? But with all of the things that are happening in the U.S. right now, and have started happening for the last several years, there is a renewed focus on the U.S. market and really growing business here. And there's a lot of new things happening in the U.S. where the U.S. is at the forefront. And Siemens is going to be right there as a leader. And so it's important that what we're seeing specifically in our U.S. market gets back to our development teams in Europe and elsewhere to really promote and optimize our products so it meets our needs here in the U.S. market. So in a nutshell, that's me.
Garett, I've got a ton of questions for you, but I do want to, pause and go into those early years, right? Because I think a critical step for any graduating engineer is finding maybe the right career path and sort of the right, I want to say, like vertical. And I think that Siemens, after talking extensively with Louis and John, offers an interesting, I want to say, that 2-year program, right? And so you made the choice of going more on like the sales and business development side. So I'm curious, if you were to paint like a picture, how did that decision come to be? Because ultimately Siemens is a very technically, I want to say, like led company. So they want people from engineering going into those roles. But I think many engineers don't know, let's say, about those career paths. So I'm curious about like that early perspective that you had.
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. And I would say, I can't say this enough to people, is get in the habit of self-reflection. So many times, at least I've been guilty of this, and I tell my kids this too, is that sometimes you get on a track and you think, like for me, I was always a technology guy, automation guy. So I always felt like, hey, I was going to be an engineer, sitting at a desk doing design work. And I started college that way too. And but I took a step back and zoomed out a bit and took a chance to self-reflect and figured out, I really love the technology. I don't want to abandon that. I really like people. Am I going to get the opportunity to interact with people the way I like to? I'm just doing development work. And at the time, I didn't have a full understanding. I was a kid. I didn't have a full understanding of everything all these roles meant. But I had my own ideas, and I talked to some people. I self-reflected and decided, I'd really like to do something that deals with people. So I talked to my career center. I talked to the companies like Siemens that were coming in, recruiting us. And that's how I got interested in sales and in business development. I just grew from there.
Interesting. Yeah. And again, I'm always like interested to hear those stories because, like I said, many engineers simply don't know what is possible, what is available after the degree. So you don't necessarily have to be that person sitting on a desk designing. So definitely appreciate that perspective.
Sure.
The other question I wanted to ask you, is maybe that perspective from like a systems integrator and like a large OEM. I think that move was also probably a big shift in your career. So I'm curious to hear like your thoughts in general when it comes to like automation. Was there any like big takeaways in how things are handled, and what was that like?
Yeah, I definitely learned quite a few things. I would say one of the biggest things I learned, coming from a manufacturer like Siemens, one of the things we try to do is we're industry leaders. So you try to get in the forefront. Sometimes forecast what you think is going to happen in the future. Try to get ahead of it. So you meet the market, skate beyond the puck, so you can receive it when it comes, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when I went to the systems integrator, the mindset's a little bit different. They were also future oriented, but they were also based in reality and dealing with customers and saying, no, this is what we have right now. We need to make these systems work. We got to make it work together. How do we do that? So I really feel like I got a better feel for what's truly important in the industry, what's truly important to customers. And you know what? We were right in a lot of ways at Siemens, but there were other things that maybe we were ahead of the game on. Maybe we were off a little bit. And so I really got to learn what mattered most to customers. And, I wish I could tell you that there was one silver bullet thing that was consistent across all of my customers, all my clients when I was at the systems integrator. There really wasn't. The thing is, there's not a one size fits all. Everyone's different. And, whether you're selling products or services, you really got to base it on needs. And so it's a needs-based mentality.
And so in your current role, Garett, we spoke a little bit about this off stream. You get to interact with customers a lot. You get to understand, I guess, like their problems. Could you paint us a better picture of what that dynamic looks like?
Yeah, so many times, so one of my functions is to support our sales team. So if we have an industrial IO opportunity and they need some help for support or closing the sale, they'll bring me in for that. There's other times, many times, we're trying to be partners with our customers, right? The idea isn't to go in and say, here's my IO, let me tell you all about it. That's not the idea. The idea is to listen, keyword listen to them, understand what's driving them, where they're trying to go, what their problems are, and how we can solve it. So I do that along with our sales team. I do that directly with customers. And I do that with my team. A lot of times I'll go have a meeting. For example, a few weeks ago, I was in Detroit meeting with automotive OEMs and got a lot of good insights from them. So one of the first things I do after those calls, I go back, I call our product marketing manager and say, hey, I just had these conversations. These guys are really focused on these areas. This is what seems was really driving them. We really need to put some emphasis on this. So we have that discussion. And then it goes a step beyond. Then we also have a conversation with our development team, many times sits in Germany. And we'll talk about, hey, this is what we need in the US. This is what we're seeing with our customers. And then they look at that and consider it and integrate it into our development processes for new products.
That is really interesting. I guess I'll let Dave jump in, but I'd be curious, to see the different areas and how it compares across verticals. That must be really interesting to see that data firsthand. But Dave, what are your thoughts?
Absolutely. No, Garett, I would love to get your perspective on how things have changed. So you've worked for Siemens for most of the last 20 years. I'm sure that there have been some fairly significant changes from how business was done 20 years ago with, I imagine, mostly Europe driving to kind of the conversation that you were having about how it's more of a collaboration. But can you kind of tell us about how things have changed, either on the development side or on the go-to-market strategy? What is different and how has it changed for the better?
Yeah, that's a really good question. 20 years ago, automation was very much, I would say, islands of automation. We would go in, you would tackle a project, you would tackle a problem, and it was an island. You didn't necessarily have connectivity among all of those islands. We had things back then that were more forward looking, like it wasn't all PLC. We had PCs and PC-based automation and things like that. But you didn't have the discussion like we do today with cybersecurity. Wasn't nearly as big of a deal back then. It certainly is now, and it's going to become even more prominent as we move forward. Also, IT, OT, and the convergence of those. No one, if you said IT, OT convergence 20 years ago, you get some really puzzled looks, because basically back then, the interaction with IT was, hey, I need to procure a PC. How do I do that? And that was about the extent of it, from my experience. Now it's very, very, very different and accelerating how quickly it's changing. So I would say those are the biggest things. The world's gotten much bigger. The automation world is much bigger. Before, you had that island, you could focus on it. Maybe you focus on a single line or a single plant. You get it to a certain point to meet the needs for automation. Today, it's much bigger than that. That machine goes to a line, that line goes to a plant, that plant goes to an enterprise, and that enterprise goes to an industry. You're even seeing information and data being shared among companies in a singular industry. You didn't have that to the same level or extent back then as we do now.
Absolutely.
Does that make sense?
No, I think that does. I think that is fantastic. I love that. And I want to continue down the theme of that, right? As we talk about standardization in automation, in my mind, it's very much continuing to break down those islands of automation, right? It's very much how, like, hopefully for the Siemens folks, we've got, all of the turquoise all across the facility. But if, hey, I can't get a particular IO or I can't get a particular VFD or something like that, no one wants a facility to go down because we can't go ahead and kind of plug and place different pieces of hardware. So can you tell us a bit more about how Siemens sees standardization in automation, the continuing of breaking down those islands?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, Dave. And yeah, so just to give you some context, let me take a step back. First of all, we've been driving towards standardization for quite a few years. But that pace of change in manufacturing that we're seeing in our overall industry is the fastest it's been in years. I think you guys would agree with that, right? I mean, especially since COVID. Think about the additional challenges that emerged during COVID that we're dealing with today: supply chain challenges, workforce challenges, et cetera. And then you look at some of the mega trends that are kind of converging and all peaking or coming into the forefront all at the same time. Mega trends like individualization, where basically we're seeing higher mix, lower volume in terms of products that are being produced. Digitalization, we all hear the buzzwords, IoT, IIoT, big data, but digitalization is a real thing because we're trying to make smarter decisions and more automated decisions. So that data, that digitalization of that data is a big deal, especially when we talk about breaking down those islands of automation. We also have disruptive technologies like artificial intelligence. Certainly in the mainstream right now, what does that mean for automation? And then things like climate change. Climate change is something that we hear a lot in the industry right now because how do you have production efficiency, but at the same time be sustainable? How do you meet that challenge? So we've had all these trends kind of converging. And the good news is, for guys like us on this podcast right now, that means more automation, right? In fact, automation is key to addressing and solving many of these challenges, which is fantastic. However, it also means that these automation solutions are much, much more complex. And that complexity can be negative, right? Complexity can have a negative impact on our business in a number of ways, both from an engineering perspective, from an operations perspective, and ultimately from a bottom line. So, and that's really where standardization comes into play. How do you tackle that complexity? How do you solve it? It's really with standardization. So while we've been building towards it, now, especially since COVID, people are looking at that rearview mirror and looking at all of the threats and risks that emerged out of that. How do they attack it? How do they approach it going forward? I think standardization is what you're seeing really ramp up as a solution for that.
I like the comment, I guess, of complexity, right? Because I've had many conversations with customers that mention, I want to say, the same keyword, and I think that in my world, complexity also brings customization, and that also leads to, well, I guess, or we're pushing towards more open platforms. I can now, if I'm a control systems engineer or programmer, I can come in with ladder logic, structured text, but now I can also come in with C#, Python, what have you, which ultimately also leads to more opportunities, but also more custom solutions, if that makes sense. So to be honest with you, I'm not sure if we're headed more in a very standardized environment or we're opening ourselves up through our own, I want to say, need to have more open systems into an area where, like I said, there's going to be so much custom, maybe code, because we are making it possible. And I think that every vendor is pretty much recognizing that end users are interested. So I'm curious, maybe your perspective on that, because I think complexity certainly drives all of these custom systems to be built.
Right. So no, but I get your point, because we're talking. I talked about earlier. It's needs based, right? And everyone is unique in what their needs are. Therefore, it makes sense that your solution is going to be a custom solution. But I think when we talk about standardization, it's about what are those building blocks of that solution. If you can have modules or a modular approach to how you build these solutions, and that modular approach, those individual modules, if you will, are based on standard technologies, whether that be protocols, whether that be the way you handle data, the way you handle security, the way you handle alarming, those types of things, then yeah, you might have solutions that look very different in terms of what you see outwardly, but the way it's built on standard components. And that's what simplifies that complexity and allows us to gain efficiencies.
I really like that. I think, I've not, I guess, like thought of it that way because I'm a lot more like on the programming side, but I think that makes a lot of sense. Dave, what are your thoughts?
I would say Vlad and I have never seen a standardized thing, Garrett, that we just don't want to turn into the craziest Rube Goldberg machine that anyone has ever seen. But I do want to dig more onto that, right? So I love the concept of complexity into modules, and then we standardize those modules and we can kind of mix and match. And while I'd love to ask if there is a customer example that you could potentially share, I don't know how many customers are quite to that point. So is there perhaps like a Siemens vision of what that would look like, either in a Siemens facility or somewhere else that you guys have kind of drawn up that would be a good example?
Yeah. I think actually there are some customers out there that are approaching this largely. I think you look at different verticals, you look at different types of customers. Many times it's the larger end users that start down this path. They're usually the innovators, and then you start to see other people follow suit. In terms of Siemens, what our approach is to really provide open standards with guardrails, right? I mean, when you say open can mean a lot of things. It's not the Wild Wild West. It's not a free-for-all. There's open standards, but there's certainly guardrails. The idea is to provide flexibility to the market, and that market's changing. Our audience is changing. Again, going back to what we saw 20 years ago, there were controls engineers everywhere. People were learning PLCs. People knew ladder logic. People wanted to do that. It was interesting. The fact of the matter is that's not so much the case anymore. We're getting people with much more of a computer science focus, IT level focus, talking about higher level languages, like you mentioned earlier, like JavaScript and Python and things like that. So I think what you're going to see from leaders like Siemens going forward is how do we meet that market? So maybe today there's one way to develop a program for a PLC. Maybe in the future there's several ways to appeal to those different types of users, because I think as we see things start to converge, you talk about the buzzword of IT/OT convergence, and you start to see these things to come together. How do we meet that market? And that's what Siemens' goal is. It's really open system with guardrails, really a larger ecosystem to really provide the market what they need to put those standard modular blocks together, put whatever solutions they need to meet their needs together.
Let me, if I may ask a question on like the governing body for standardization. I think that there's multiple, I want to say, stakeholders in this process, and we see, I want to say, a greater emergence, at least, of bodies that try and standardize. And I think it was also industry specific, right? So the food and bev has like PACML standards for, let's say, like PLC codes. There's going to be ISA standards. And so I'm curious, like, what your perspective is on who should be almost driving this. Is it maybe everybody? Is it, certain groups more than others? Is it the end users? Is it integrators? Is it OEMs? Is it, like I said, these like independent bodies? Maybe the government needs to step in to help in on some of this. So I'm curious who ultimately is maybe the owner of, setting these standards and ultimately trying to proliferate them, if I will, to ultimately the end users who would benefit from them.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's a big question, Vlad, because I'm not sure you're going to get a standard answer from anyone. From my perspective, though, I really think it's the overall ecosystem. So, and how does that come together? Many times when you look, say you take a vertical industry, say it's something in intralogistics. So PACML might come into play as an example. Many times what you get the very large end users. These are the guys with the deep pockets, right? These are the guys with the funding and the personnel and the resources to really invest. They're typically the trendsetters. So they will start down that path because they have the ability to do it. Manufacturers, which are also right there leading in those discussions with those large end users. Then you have the system integrators. They come in and part of that ecosystem that has to execute on, all right, this all sounds great. How do we bring it together? What's the reality of the situation? And then as the users do it, then you start to see OEMs start to follow suit, and they jump in, and then it builds a coalition. And then sometimes it gets so big, you got to have maybe the government or these governing bodies that step in to really put some governance and some wrappers around these standards. So I think it can be somewhat organic in the way that it develops, but that's kind of how I see the process taking place.
And it's an interesting perspective, right? Because I think, and this is less of a question, but more of a comment. I think it's a complex problem, right? Because from an end user standpoint, if you are developing a standard that benefits you internally, it then becomes a question like, why would you share that externally, right? And the argument could be made that, if we all rise, you also rise, but it's also, I want to say, not the right incentive. So I would see how, the OEMs and maybe these third-party governing bodies would be more and in a less biased way be positioned to create these standards. But again, I don't think, as you said, there's a right or wrong necessarily answer.
Yeah, but I really think so. It's really the market will kind of shows the direction of where we need to go. But I think also you got to look at some of the other trends that we're seeing. You're right. Why would a company share that if it's a competitive advantage? The thing is, though, I think many times what we're starting to face is, especially as in specific industries, is we talk about some of the trends that we're seeing. One of those trends that we're seeing increased automation, increasing need to automate. We don't have the people, right? So there's there was an article in the Harvard Business Review that recently came out. They said there's going to be 3.4 billion manufacturing jobs, big number, available over the next 10 years, over the next decade here in the U.S. But 2 million of those are going to go unfilled. So we don't have the people, we don't have the expertise unless some things change today. At the same time that's happening, you have, I'll throw some more numbers at you. We call it standardization. There was, I don't think you ever followed a wholesale blog, but there was an article that they put out there that said 50%, there's 50% reduction on manufacturers' cost by standardization in products, parts, and processes as possible. So you have that. And you also have, so you have all these pressures on the industry, on these companies, to the point that you're starting to see managers say, hey, I'm willing to share some of this information outside of my company because it helps my overall ecosystem. It helps my suppliers get aligned with what we're doing, helps my OEMs get aligned with what we're doing, helps my system integrators, rationalize and justify the investment they have to make to get in line with this. In fact, another number, the Boston Consulting Group had a survey that they did that 72% of managers say they're considering data sharing to improve their operations. That's because as we grow as quickly as we're growing, we're seeing more and more challenges solved by automation. That's great, but we have fewer and fewer people to meet that demand. So how do we get better as an industry? And that's where you start sharing that information, which maybe 20 years ago, that was a competitive advantage. But now you see it bigger picture, it can help you grow.
No, I would definitely hope that more manufacturers would share that same vision. I think it's still, they need some nudging, so to speak, in order to share a little bit better, in my opinion. Dave, do you want to bring in? There's a few good comments in chat that we've gotten.
Absolutely. So let's go ahead and bring in Johnny's comment here, talking about one of his main issues with standardization is the legacy "we've always done it this way" mentality. And Dan has commented about how that is like the worst reason for not wanting to adapt, that he hears all the time. I will make the funny story. A year or a couple of years ago, I worked with an organization and we tried to bring in version control or revision control of just their documentation. And the reason why we couldn't do it was quite literally, and their words were, we change things so often, I don't know why we would start with revision or version control. And that's just kind of one of you throw your hands up in the air and you kind of walk away because you're not going to win that one. And there's a reason why I'm not continuing to help that group. And then Dan has got a comment here talking about how he sees lots of ladder programmers calling structured text garbage, and that they both have very specific and ideal use cases, and those from a higher level of scripting and IT understand structured text much better. I think that's a really great comment, Dan. So a lot of times when we kind of have that conversation or that debate, it is very much depending upon where the program or where the person has come in. They might be more comfortable with that, or an organization might have standards on it, or it might be easier to write a specific series of programs or commands in one language versus another, despite the fact that there are some ladder logic wizards out there that can write a literal entire MES all based on ladder, and no one knows how they do it. And I personally just don't want to know how they do it, because I imagine that they spend just way too much time sitting there typing on the keyboard. But I want to talk a bit about that innovation, Garett. And so last month we were talking to a bunch of systems integrators and innovators, right? And the reoccurring theme of who should be driving the technologies came up, right? And so I want to talk about the standardization. So who should be the groups, or what percentage should each group be driving the adoption of this standardization? Should it be the OEMs like Siemens? Should it be the systems integrators trying to get their end users to standardize? Should it be the end users realizing that they can probably save a bunch of money if they standardize on a smaller series of parts? From your perspective, where does that responsibility lie, or where will that responsibility lie in the future?
I think today, and certainly it'll become even more important as we go into the future, that responsibility is with all of the above. There's a role to be played for everyone. This isn't something where, hey, this person needs to do this for this to work. This is something we got to come together as an ecosystem and make it work. And there's a role for everyone. Again, many times it starts at the end user level, especially the large end users, because that's where the deeper pockets are at. That leads to demand for OEMs to really get on board if they're going to be able to sell their machines, right? That leads to system integrators say, hey, this is what's happening in the market. We got to jump in. And I think to make sure it's done is efficiently and as intelligently as possible, we all got to do our part to contribute. I think it's just like I said earlier. My role is IO, but it doesn't mean I'm going in with a block of IO and talking to a customer about all the features, functions, and benefits of that little block of IO. We're trying to solve problems. So I think that's where maybe you're not the guy with the deep pockets with the initial need, but as a systems integrator, you can come in. You have some experience. You have some knowledge. It's certainly valuable. You should be open and contribute with that. OEMs should do the same thing. So I really think it's everyone coming together as an overall industry that's responsible for it. Then you did get into the point where you need some governance, right? And that's where you get into some of these outside groups and like the governance of that. That's really how I see it. And I think when we look at standardization, right, and some of the comments that came up, it's important to understand, we say standardization, but that's a really big term, right? It's a big word. What exactly does standardization mean? And we can talk about standardize on ladder logic, or standardize on this, or standardize on that. And someone made the comment about, well, we've always done it this way, so we're not going to change. That is not the right approach for standardization. When you think standardization, it's important to, first of all, be in the mindset. And this might be a cultural change for some. And this is something we're in a transitional phase right now where, I always say, start small and think big, right? So in other words, step number one, what's your plan? What's your big picture, holistic plan? Where are you going to go? Step two, focus. Focus on the low-hanging fruit. What are the quickest and easiest things that you can do in the shortest amount of time that's going to get you the greatest amount of return? That's what you should focus on first, because the whole standardization thing is a journey, right? It should be phased in. It should be an iterative approach. Then, once you get those first few focus areas out of the way, then you scale. Then you extend. You scale up from there. And then the last step is, and this goes to the comment, is continuous improvement. You should always be striving to get better. Therefore, you should never get a comment, well, this is the way we've always done it. Therefore, this is the way we're going to do it. If there's good reasons to reevaluate it, that self-reflection, that continuous improvement should always be in place, because the world changes. We talk about how quickly the world's changing now. If you have a standard that's been in place for 20 years, you better consider changing it, because otherwise you're going to be left behind, and that you're either going to be purchased or you're going to go out of business.
I like that. I definitely resonate with especially that last comment. Gentlemen, if I guess I'd like to take a step back a little bit, because I think this is our first episode on standardization, and I think maybe we need to set the stage a little bit better, right? So I think that in manufacturing, there's a lot of different standardizations that could happen even on the, let's say, employee side, on the operator side, on the Lean Six Sigma side. So I think that for the context of the conversation we're having, it's mostly on the automation side. So when it comes to maybe hardware, when it comes to software, when it comes to at least protocols, when it comes to deploying automation in manufacturing in general. So Garett, could you give us maybe a little bit of a synopsis what standardization looks like, let's say in your conversations, and what kind of discussions you're having with different stakeholders.
Yeah, yeah. So I think when you look at standardization in automation, the way we look at it is first look at a plant or even an enterprise, right? When you look at integration within that plant or integration within that plant or within that enterprise, you have both horizontal integration and vertical integration. So think of horizontal integration is when you're on that factory floor, right? You have machines and you have lines. And you want to be able to standardize so you have the same types of, for the machine engineering, you want to standardize on machine engineering so you get consistency and standards across the horizontal slice, which is on the factory floor. Then beyond that, you have the vertical integration. So that's when you're getting up more to layers that also involve IT and then eventually solely up to IT when you get up to that ERP system and things like that. So then you got to think about communication. How do you communicate? How do you communicate in a way that's not disruptive to the OT side, but still giving the IT side everything that they need, and you're getting all that information up at the vertical level. So you think of it from a horizontal perspective and a vertical perspective. You think about it in terms of machine engineering, line engineering, safety is a big one. You think about it in terms of diagnostics, so how you handle your errors and alarming, what that concept looks like. Your operator concept, so what does visualization look like? What do the operator, what do they need to operate? Because the goal is, again, we have workforce challenges, right? One advantage of standardization is if all of your lines and all your machines have a standard way to operate them, then you can have cross-training and cross-functions for each of those operators, therefore gaining efficiency in the way you operate your business. But that's really it. So it's machine engineering, it's line integration, it's safety, it's diagnostics with error alarm, and alarm handling, and it's that operator concept.
Awesome. Dave, what are your thoughts?
I love that. Garett, you've talked earlier in the conversation about how many kind of larger companies with larger budgets are leading the way. In your current role, do you get to work with a lot of these innovation centers helping kind of shape what standardization is going to look like for them and for most of the rest of the industry?
Yeah, I certainly get involved in those conversations. For me right now, while I'm the IO guy, it's all about solutions, right? And so I'll back up a little bit to my previous role when I was the systems integrator, because I even got a more holistic view even when I was there. And I tell you what, guys, it's crazy, but sometimes when you think of companies, you think these big name companies, they got their stuff together. You can go in there and they have these standards. You know what? You go in there, they don't got their stuff together. And then you go into other companies, and they really do. They're at the forefront. It's best practice stuff. I've seen all of it. And what we would do, and this is something we can do at Siemens, is really go in and it starts with that vision. Again, step one. What's the objective? What's the plan? Where do you want to go? And then partnering and identifying ways to get there. So you get things like design guides and technology guides, and you really start defining what that looks like. We did that a lot. I saw that a lot. I see that a lot at Siemens. I saw it a lot as a systems integrator. One reason why I started seeing a lot of it is how much attrition have you guys seen with your customers in the automation space over the years? There's been a lot of attrition, a lot of turnover, right? So, and many times all that knowledge is going right out the door. So how do you keep it? You got to standardize. You got to have standardization. You got to have a standard way of doing things. Otherwise, you might have that one guy that did things a certain way with that certain programming language, and he leaves or he retires, and there's nothing you can do except start over. That's incredibly inefficient. And you're looking at that introduction of that incredible level of inefficiency at a time when we don't have the people to do the work. So standardization is very important. We're definitely seeing it at Siemens. At Siemens, we're taking, again, that partnering approach, a consultative approach where our customers know what they do. They know what they do very well. They know it better than us. But we know automation. We know, and we bring perspective from all different aspects and verticals of what we see in industry and bring that to bear. So again, when we talk about who contributes to the value that comes into the standardization discussion, it's an ecosystem. There's a role for the manufacturer, a role for systems integrators, there's a role for the OEM, there's a role for the end user. And many times these conversations they really are, especially with the leaders in these efforts that are really including all of those stakeholders.
Garett, I want to ask. I want to say like a difficult question because I think that it's important to recognize that standardization, as you said, sometimes is a journey, right? So there's definitely, I want to see a lot of wins that you can get as you progress through that. But what are maybe in your conversation some of the quicker wins that, let's say, a manufacturer could gain through standardizing, right? It's not going to be, let's say, a person that retires in 10 years, because I think sometimes maybe that first hurdle, right, like to standardize takes a lot of effort and time and ultimately investment. And so until you see those first results, it becomes difficult to continue to invest. So in your conversations, what do you try and explain to them? What are some of the quicker wins that they could realize?
Yeah, well, that sets me up pretty well to talk about my focus today, which is I/O. So
Okay.
certainly I/O. I can tell you when we look at standardization with I/O, you know, there's more foreign investment coming to the U.S. now than ever before. In fact, if you look at it globally, the U.S. is number one for foreign investment. China is a distant number two. With that investment, we're seeing more greenfield facility growth than we've seen in years, right? Coming to the U.S. So we have greenfield facilities coming in. We also have brownfield facilities coming in. So what that means is, for me, many times I say low-hanging fruit is I/O. We're trying to get more and more data. How do we get it in? If you're an OEM, your business maybe is in the U.S. where maybe you see more one type of automation system, but your customers also now very much in Europe, or maybe you see another type. So you have different ways to communicate. Maybe you have a field bus. In one case, it might be Modbus TCP. Another case, it might be Ethernet IP. But everything you have designed is Profinet because you've been using Siemens. Well, what if we start with the I/O? We standardize on the I/O, and the I/O can communicate all of them. There's nothing you have to change. One piece of hardware, the same I/O communicates all those field buses. You design it once, you're done. Your drawings are done once, you're done. And you just change the ink software, the protocol that you're communicating. So again, I/O, if you look at a control system, many times I/O is one of the largest portions of that control system, if not the largest, in terms of investment and product. So if you can standardize there, that's a big deal. So that's the area where I start typically. Now I might be biased towards I/O, but the point is there's always that point where there is that low-hanging fruit, where you really can stress on something. It can be an easier approach, and you can see quick returns.
Awesome. Unintentional setup, but I like it. I've certainly worked on many control systems in which I/O either like needs to be replaced, changed, and ultimately, as you said, also augmented at this stage to get data into higher level systems. So definitely
Yeah,
see
and you're seeing that. Higher level systems. So IT communication. So you look at field bus for the OT side, but for IT side, you're starting to see the IT protocols come into play even at the I/O level. So you look at protocols like OPC UA, MQTT, et cetera. So how do you communicate those? That's something that we're doing at Siemens. Again, trying to meet the market where the market's going. Skate beyond the puck so we can receive the pass, right? So in that way, if we have an I/O solution that you can standardize on, and you can have the field bus that you need. You can also provide IT the data that they need because you have that communication capability. And also you have a breadth of product that whether you have, let's say, a cabinet or on a machine, you have all of the above. That's a big deal. And that saves money in a variety of ways in terms of spare parts, challenge workforce in terms of very streamlined. They only need to know one platform. I could go on and on.
Absolutely. Dave, what are your thoughts? You also had some interesting comments in the chat.
I did. I had some interesting comments. I do want to go highlight chat. So Lewis says standardized automation doesn't mean vendor lock scenarios. It's actually the opposite. And I think that this is a really good point. Standardizing interfaces and connecting data models address challenges from customization, digitalization, workforce, and even climate change. Just depends upon the challenge and what is important. Start small and then scale. And then Arun was agreeing, saying that the nuanced definition of standardization, it is those standardizing interfaces, but not necessarily standardizing on one vendor or platform. One could almost say that it's important not to standardize on one vendor or platform, because then you get to what Daniel was talking about, a very siloed, very locked in of everything in the 90s. So I want to go ahead and dig into this. But first, we've got some people to thank. So we want to thank Siemens for sponsoring standardization in automation, sustainability, product customization, digitalization, new technologies, and competitors. Manufacturing continues to grow more complex. Standardization is our answer to these challenges. The more standardized technologies, systems, processes, and interfaces become, the faster and more cost effectively you can drive your automation and digitalization forward. How can you boost your flexibility and competitiveness? What probably happens when you change from the machine supplier and then you have to integrate automation systems from different vendors? Without standardization, you need more employees with different skills, lose flexibility and time on the integration process, and have to expect longer downtimes. With standardization, you can avoid these problems and gain both flexibility and competitive advantages. Want to learn more? Check out Siemens.com, a whole bunch of other things /standardization. We will go ahead and drop that link in all of the chats below. And if you guys are listening on podcast form, you guys can go ahead and check the show notes as well. But no, I think that's really important. And I do want to thank Lewis and Arun for making that. I feel like you guys set up the ad read absolutely fantastically. So thank you guys for going ahead and setting that up. And Garett, I know that we talked a couple of quick wins. I know that we had talked about ways to kind of save money on the IO. I want to kind of have a bit broader conversation around standardization and what you're seeing. Maybe you can share an experience. I've got an experience or a couple of experiences that I can go ahead and share talking about standardizing, maybe not necessarily on one vendor or hardware, but the business benefits that organizations see.
Yeah, certainly. And I think that's an important point. It's not necessarily one vendor or hardware. And I know sometimes it's perceived as Siemens is a product vendor. But that's what I talked about earlier. You know, as a manufacturer, I think what you're going to see, you're certainly going to see from Siemens, is more of an open approach to where there's a variety of ways of meeting that standardization goal. And at Siemens, we're way more than a product company. You got to look at the full package, what level of service, support, expertise, all these things are valuable. And what does that mean? In terms of where we're seeing some early wins with standardization and really seeing some early returns, I'll go back to where I was working with a food and beverage company, and they're doing very well, and they're expanding around the country and around the world. They have new plants that they're bringing into their overall enterprise, and they've gone down the standardization path, and they started this quite a few years ago. And so they're more sophisticated and further along than a lot of other people in the industry may be. But they've had a number of challenges. They went through COVID like everyone else. They lost a lot of people, but what saved them is they had those standards in place. So they were able to bring new people on board and onboard them quicker than what any of their competitors could do. So that's a competitive advantage. Number two, when they need to scale and expand, they have these standards in place, so they can go into the new facilities that they've procured, and they have a recipe, if you will, for how to bring that up to speed, and they know how to prioritize it in order to realize a greater return on that investment sooner rather than later. Sometimes, if you don't have that standard in place, that you have a new facility or you look to scale, whether that scale is a new machine, a new line, or a new plant, it can take quite a while to see the return on that investment because you're starting everything from scratch. Standardization, you see it early on. That's what we saw with this food and beverage company. Is they're looking at bringing these new plants online and start their standardization approach right away, and they're going to see returns on that investment in a positive way year one.
Interesting.
Absolutely.
If I can follow up maybe with one question on that integration project and standardization, like who's I think like in general the driving force behind that? Is that like a corporate engineering role? Do they bring in maybe an external consultant who can audit and help them architect the solution? Like what does that maybe dynamic look like to maybe focus that we need to create certain standards in order to grow in a scalable fashion?
Largely what it looks like is these days, typically, there's decisions that are made by consensus, right? There's typically not a single decision maker. That applies in terms of individuals. It also applies in terms of organizations, to where many times they'll come in and maybe they'll have a consultant come in and they'll do a strategic analysis of their business and say, you know what, if you implement an MES system in your enterprise, that you can realize 5% that goes to your bottom line in terms of profitability once that's implemented, right? So many times it starts with maybe end users say, hey, we need to do something here. How do we grow our business? We don't know what that looks like, so let's bring in this consultant. Maybe the consultant is someone like a manufacturer like Siemens, maybe it's an engineering firm, it could be a variety of different types of entities. Bring them in, do that analysis, and really say, maybe there's several outputs that come out of that analysis. In this specific case I'm talking about for MES, that's a real example. And they recognize, hey, MES is something that can help us in a number of ways. So we're going to focus on that right away. That MES example actually led to they had to modernize their facility in order to get the data they needed to feed that MES system. So it led to all kinds of new projects and new automation investments that they had to make. But it started there. That's where they started. They started with MES, and then they said, well, we also need to do this, this, and this, and they prioritized those items, and the plan just grew from there. And again, that goes back to that continuous improvement step. You're always trying to get better, always striving to do more. So you're always building. So kind of got a little bit off track a little bit with my explanation there, but I think you guys know what I'm getting at with that.
Yeah, and it's an interesting, it's an interesting, I think, challenge that many end users face, right? Because I think they're trying to figure out, can they do this, I want to say, quote unquote, transformation internally, or they need to bring in an outside perspective that understands what is possible and ultimately doesn't have that, those like blinders that say, like, we've always done it this way, right? And so it needs to be someone with like an IT, OT probably perspective that understands these decisions, like on the business side as well. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly, you make a good point. But IT/OT, 20 years ago, we were primarily working with OT people. Now, I can tell you, when we're approaching a large investment or initiative, IT is almost always involved. And in some cases today, you're even seeing IT be at the forefront or even the lead of some of these projects that have a significant OT component. Now, there's a lot of ways to do that, a lot of ways to do it right, a lot of ways to do it wrong, but you're seeing it. And I think that my point is, you're seeing IT come into this equation more and more, becoming more and more prominent. And it's incumbent upon manufacturers like Siemens, OEMs, systems integrators, to figure out, how do we speak that language together? How do we come to a common language? I don't think it's ever going to get to a point where IT people are doing all the OT functions, or OT people are doing the IT functions. I don't think that's the right approach. I don't think that's what we're going to see. But you are going to see, right now it looks pretty cloudy sometimes, pretty muddy. Then you're going to start to see that clear up a little bit, and you're going to see more of a teaming approach and really more of a defined definition of roles and responsibilities for new large investments and projects.
Dave, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think that all of those are really good. Let me go ahead and share kind of an example similar to what Garett was saying about standardization. I think we've got some really good comments about standardization of interfaces. I've seen it kind of time and time again. Many organizations have a bunch of different machines from 2 or 3 different vendors, from half a dozen different versions of those. And so it takes weeks or months to go ahead and onboard someone to any particular machine. And so if a person kind of down the line, I especially at this point kind of quits or leaves, decides they don't want to come into work or kind of have any of those other issues, then you very potentially have a machine down opportunity. When I was in integration, I went and looked at a job. It was at an injection molding facility, and they had 2 different main manufacturers, and they each had 3 or 4 different versions of the machine, right? And so all of the interfaces looked really ugly, but beyond them all looking really ugly, they were all just different, right? Like different buttons were in different places, which doesn't make it easy to onboard anyone, much less onboard anyone from 7 or 8 or 7 or 10 different versions and sets of screens as you go through that. So what initially became a conversation of, hey, let's go collect some data, turned into the, hey, there is a huge return on investment of just going and standardizing the HMI interfaces across all of the machines. And it doesn't matter what software platform that is at, as long as you go through the process of standardizing what those opportunities look like, you can easily go ahead and onboard people to one machine. And then once you've onboarded them from one machine, you've onboarded them to 10 or 12 different machines. So I think that, I guess my hope, similar to Garett's kind of global food and beverage manufacturer, is that we will see more groups kind of understand the value of that, especially as it becomes more and more difficult to go find and hire and train and retain people on the shop floor in and of itself. The biggest opportunities, the biggest opportunities, the biggest opportunities lie there on the plant floor. And Daniel, I feel like I have certainly in spirit been to your plant, but also it kind of makes me worried a little bit. Maybe I should just stay as far away from your plant as possible. But no, Garett. So I think that this has been a super interesting conversation about this so far. I don't know if you had any other thoughts, right? We've gotten a little bit deep on a couple of parts of standardization, but as we've discussed at the beginning, there are so many different things of standardization that we could talk about. So are there any things that we want to get into that we should have as part of this conversation in standardization? Any other topics?
Yeah, Dave, the only thing I would re-emphasize that again, standardization is a journey. Standardization is going to mean different things to different people. The first step is to take a step back, reflect, and decide holistically what it means for you and what your goals are. And then don't let it be overwhelming. I don't think standardization is not this magical thing that's just come up, right? People have known for years and years and years and years that sometimes they need to standardize, or maybe they need to change their standards or readdress their standards, right? And they haven't done it. Sometimes I feel like they haven't done it because it can be overwhelming. Where do you start? And I think that's just it. Don't get overwhelmed. Take an iterative approach. Get that overall holistic view first, and then pick things off one piece at a time. And I think especially as we're seeing all this growth coming into the U.S., right? Take advantage of your ecosystem. Leverage your system integration partners, your OEM partners. You talk to your end users. Work with your manufacturers that see things from a variety of perspectives. That diversity of perspective can really many times help provide the most optimized solution. So communicate is a main message here.
Absolutely. What are your thoughts, Vlad? Are there anything else that we should make sure that we hit on during this first conversation?
Garett, I would be curious, maybe there's a lot of new technologies, like we discussed, there's, I want to say, like higher level keywords that you can use to describe them, but I think there's very tangible, I want to say, technologies that are coming into the manufacturing floor. Do you have any comments about what some of them are going to do towards standardization? Are there going to be more impactful ones than the other? I think we're seeing, so for a while, I think we saw a lot of cloud adoption. I think now we've realized, to the data point you made earlier, there's a need to have those concentrators and processors and IPCs a little bit closer to the edge. So that's what I'm at least like personally seeing. So there's obviously a need to collect that data, but also to process the data and ultimately make decisions with that data. So I think that provides an interesting opportunity to standardize that data flow. But I'm curious if you have like perspectives of, again, like different tools and different maybe technologies that are coming out that will help with standardizing.
Yeah, there's a number of things I comment on here. One thing I'll comment on is one of the things we're seeing, especially from IO level. Again, let me go back to my bias there. Is you see open standards like IO Link, technology that's been around for years, right? Probably a dozen years or so.
Yep.
But it's really starting to get traction these days. And the reason why it's getting traction is because of the standardization message. People are looking at ways to do things easier, do things in a more standardized way. So you're seeing that. So that's not a new technology, but it's one that's been around for a while. It's really starting to get traction these days. The big one that everyone talks about these days because it's so mainstream is artificial intelligence and machine learning, right? And while it's certainly the mainstream now, so everyone talks about it, there's a lot of fears out there, just a lot of things going on. The fact of the matter is we've been doing machine learning for quite some time, and even artificial intelligence for quite some time now. It's advancing at a pace now that we've never seen before. But again, all the more reason to standardize, because if you have an artificial intelligence making decisions for a process or for a facility, you want to make sure it's getting the best information possible, right? Therefore, you got to standardize on how you collect that data, package that data, and deliver that data. So I think we're going to see a lot more artificial intelligence coming into play for a variety of reasons, a variety of use cases across the industry, both in terms of from the development side, engineering side, business side, operation side, all facets of business. And I think standardization is a critical step as we see this, because again, we want to make better decisions, and we think that the way to make better decisions is by deploying artificial intelligence. We better make sure we start with a good data set. You do that with standardization.
Awesome. Definitely. I really like the perspective. We talked a little bit, about the size of the companies that can pioneer standardization. I wanted to get also your perspective on the industry, right? So if I'm, let's say, an engineer in food and beverage, I would not consider food and beverage to always be the pioneer, but maybe I would be looking at, let's say, automotive. I would be looking at pharmaceuticals. Like, do you have a perspective of which industries are maybe pioneering most standardization in their facility? So I'm just curious to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think there's probably multiple answers to this, but I would say it's those industries where you're seeing the strong customer demand and also a lot of changes. So automotive is one, right? As we look at the EV, the electric vehicles, the initiative there, there's a lot of things that are happening on that forefront. That business is changing. So that business is changing. The way they manufacture the products is also changing, and that's leading to innovation and changes in approach in the industry. So automotive is certainly one with EV. You also got to look at what we've seen with the supply chain shortage with semiconductor and the reshoring of semiconductor production here in the U.S. and all the new semiconductor greenfield facilities and expansions that are coming in. Because of all this expansion, again, this is where you're getting a lot of the diversity of thought and a lot of the innovation coming into play. So that's another industry that I would say is on the leading edge. And really, I could go down the list, but it's really those industries where you're seeing the most activity, where you're seeing the most money. Follow the dollar. Where the money's going, that's where you're seeing the innovation and the investment.
And maybe it's also that entire like greenfield component, right? Because I think it allows you a bit more of a kind of like a mindset to let's take a pause. Let's not just reapply what we've been doing for a long time. Let's really rethink the architecture and sort of standardize in a way that, as I said, will allow us to copy paste that design or just allow people to commit a lot more easier. So maybe that too is an interesting topic on that side.
Yeah, it's all needs based. I mean, another industry we could reference would be defense industry, right? They've been in a mode for doing things a certain way for quite a few years now, and now geopolitical reasons are really changing things in the world, and all of a sudden there's a lot more demand. So we're seeing greenfield facilities being built for defense industry today too. So we're seeing that more and more, and because they see such a demand and need to increase and ramp up and scale production, you're really seeing a lot of innovation in that space. So again, it really comes back to where the needs at from a market perspective. Therefore, where's the money being applied, and that's where you see a lot of innovation.
Interesting. Dave, thoughts, comments?
I think it's really interesting, and I feel like those comments have very much set us up to one of my favorite parts of the show, Garrett, where we put you on the hot seat and we ask you to predict the future, right? I think you gave us a bunch of really good ideas, good concepts throughout all of this, including the follow the money, including the artificial intelligence. But what do you predict that the future of the standardization and automation is going to look like in the next 2 to 5 years?
Yeah, I'm not sure how good my crystal ball is, but I'll give it a shot. I think what we're going to continue to see, I do think standardization is a trend that you're going to, while people are starting to talk about it more now, I think you're going to see it grow. And I think it's growing out of necessity because we're seeing, we've talked about big data for years now. Now we got the processing power and we have the methods to get the data in place. How do we use it intelligently? That's where you're going to start seeing more artificial intelligence being deployed. There's a variety of use cases there for predictive control, predictive maintenance, simulation, et cetera. So I think you're going to see a lot more of that. Then you're going to see a lot more modularization. We use the term plug and produce at Siemens, but that's where you're going to see, as we look at this innovation and we look at automation and developing and expanding brownfields and greenfields, how do you do it intelligently? You don't want to reinvent the wheel every time. So I think you're going to see a lot more standardization in terms of libraries, technology really leading to these standard modules. These modules that can be applied in a variety of ways and essentially plug and produce. So, I think the need that you see for that, what's really going to be driving that is we have all this data coming in, we're getting the data, we leverage artificial intelligence and the processing power that we have there now to really make those decisions. And you see more efficient plants. Some people will say, sometimes I went to get a haircut a few weeks ago, And the barber asked me, so what do you do for a living? And I always struggle to answer that question, right? Because I try to explain it, no one knows what the heck I mean. So I just basically tell them, yeah, I'm one of those guys, doing factory automation. And anytime you have a plant, they automate the plant, we do the automation. And they understood that, but they kind of took me back. They said, well, so people are losing their jobs to automation, to all these things. And that's something that I talked to them about it, but that's something that we see, and that's something that a lot of people talk about. But I don't think that's true. I think maybe our jobs change, but there's still going to be jobs. We're just going to have to make adjustments, and there's going to be changes in what we do. So I think you're going to see a lot of changes in the workforce in terms of how it's applied and how it's leveraged in the industry. I think those of us in the automation industry, we need to put people's minds at ease the best that we can. And no, we're not out there replacing jobs. Sure, there will be some jobs lost and some jobs will change, but there's lots of new opportunities being created as well.
Absolutely. No, I like that. I feel like that's a very elegant way to explain what you do. I've given up on explaining what I do to most people, Garett, but I appreciate that you're still out there fighting the good fight, so that hopefully one day people will know what automation actually is. No, this has been fantastic. So Garett, as you know, we love to ask people for a book recommendation. So I know that you've got something to talk to us about today.
Yeah. There's a book that I read a few years ago. It's called Great by Choice by Jim Collins and Morton Hansen. And really what this book applies to, it applies to just organizations as well as individuals, right? Your choices that we make in everyday life to be great. One of the topics that's covered in this book is a concept called the 20-mile march. And really what it's about is discipline, and it really talks about discipline and pacing growth. So whether that growth is personal growth or that growth is organizational business growth, I think it's important to think about, set a smart goal for how much you want to grow in a specific period of time. So, and the point is if you have aspirations to grow and set a goal to grow too fast, too quickly, many times you wear yourself out. That applies to an individual. It also applies to an organization. Sometimes your goals are too low. You go too slowly. I think it's important to set the right goal and try to hit that consistently year after year after year. What it does, sometimes it makes us uncomfortable because sometimes you're growing too slowly and you really have to buckle down and do some new things to hit that growth goal. Other times, maybe you're going really, really fast, right? Or you're about to hit your goal really, really fast. You're like, well, I could do more. But sometimes by doing that, you wear yourself out, or you wear your organization out. And it's important to know when to pull the reins back a little bit and just have good, consistent, solid growth or development. That's what this concept that's covered in this book, Great by Choice, is all about, the 20-mile march. And I encourage you guys to check it out and see what you think about it.
Interesting. No, I think it's an interesting concept. I have not read that Jim Collins book, but I've appreciated the other Jim Collins books that I've read in the past. So thank you for that, Garett. Next question is, we'd love some career advice, right? So typically we like to talk to folks early to mid-career. I know you gave us some really interesting kind of nuggets and tidbits throughout all the way, but if someone is kind of early mid-career and they say, hey, Garett, what's the best piece of career advice do you have? What would you give them?
That's a good question. I would say be open-minded. Sometimes we go in, we have preconceptions about who we are, what we want to do, and what certain things are. I would say one of the most important things, especially if you're early career, or even mid-career, or even more senior in your career, be open-minded. Listen to opportunities, understand different opportunities that are out there, and then again, go back to self-reflection. Reflect on what's really important to you, where your passion is at, and what's your personal path to get there. I see quite frankly where people get on a path and they think, gosh, no matter what, they got to stay on that path. It's not true. It's important to be open-minded, and always take an opportunity to take a step back, zoom out, and get new perspective, and then adjust. So that would be my high-level guidance.
And I love that. And Garett, as I said, it might be that I've just come back from vacation, that I didn't go look at the computer for a week, but I absolutely love the comment on reflection. I think it's exceptionally important, absolutely underrated in regards to advice. And Jessie had a really good comment about jobs being replaced by automation, and how that they're the dangerous and dull or dirty for humans to perform. and they think that it's a really good perspective as we help navigate the shift. And I think that that's also, I would agree with all of those comments. Garett, last question we have for you today is who should reach out? Who do you want to connect with? I imagine that Siemens is always hiring, but kind of your opportunity to ask our listeners anything you want as a thank you for coming and chatting with us.
Yeah, no, first of all, I do want to say I appreciate everyone's time. Certainly appreciate you guys listening to me for the last hour. In terms of contact, feel free to reach out to me directly. I'm on LinkedIn, so that's probably the best way to reach me, and I can help you, especially anything related to Siemens. I've been around Siemens for a very long time, so I can help you navigate things with Siemens. Also, I've been around the industry a long time, so I can help you navigate things there too. So don't hesitate to reach out. LinkedIn is a great place to start, and then I can share my information beyond that.
Absolutely, Garett. Thank you so much. And everyone, thank you for coming and hanging out. We had a couple of dozen people live in the LinkedIn chat for most of the conversation. It was very busy. So thank you, everyone, for coming and hanging out today. If you guys have made it all the way through, please make sure that you've connected with Garett and myself and Vlad. Please make sure that you've been following the Manufacturing Hub podcast. And if you guys have made it this far on podcast form, thank you guys for that. Please hit the follow. Please go rate us 5 stars in all of the places that you can go rate us 5 stars. I have learned that if we ask people to like and follow along, Garett, people like and follow along. So that makes it better. Again, thank you to Siemens for sponsoring this. Come check us out every Wednesday this month, talking about standardization in automation. Until next time, we'll see everyone soon.